Hello, my name is Olorotimiosha, and I'm continuing with my discussion on the America's romanticizing of insanity and just viewing President Trump's actions, which really are beyond the pale, and unfortunately looking at America's reaction, America's response and treatment to President Trump's actions. We don't in any way demonstrate any form of equanimity. Um, so, we're now, observing how America's unrivaled, hitherto unrivaled supremacy, which wasn't just in military, our global supremacy was not just in our military capacity. It was in the way the rest of the world responded to our cultural ascendancy, right? People were in love with American culture, American politics, American politicians, American musicians, American actors, with Hollywood. But since this ill advised and unprovoked illegal war with Iran, things seem to have changed so drastically within a month. We're seeing um, Iran's Iran's government officials being love bombed with all sorts of they're inundated with all sorts of love emojis on the internet, on social media, right? The Iran foreign minister is the Arachi. He's being love bombed. Everybody's just displaying this great affection for Iran's government officials and their spokesmen. There's a professor, I think, what's his name? I'm not going to butcher his name, so I'm not going to say it. There's a professor who wears glasses and he speaks for Iran. Apparently, he was born in America. And the media has been circulating how he should run for US president, even though he lives in Iran and he's obviously at war with America, right? He's a spokesman for Iran. And his response was, well, he wouldn't qualify because he's not in the Epstein files, so Iran is looking more like they're in a position America used to be in when they were at war with a nation America would have projected as a rogue nation, right? America, portrayed certain nations as rogue nations, and managed to be able to ostracize certain nations, and Iran was one of them. But America's actions, the blatant violation of international law with the decapitation of the Iranian government's leadership, with the assassination of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, right, and other generals, other cabinet members of Iran's government. Those are blatant violations of international law. I've discussed Justa Causa and Jussit Bellum and how America's violated international law because they didn't have a just cause for going to war, right? And of course, with the carpet bombing of civilians, now I think roughly 6,000 Iranians have, it depends on the estimates, between 2,000 to 6,000 Iranians are said to be dead since the war started, and over 20,000 injured, right? Their infrastructure has been destroyed. And, the president was recently tweeting that that was on Chris, on, sorry, on Easter Sunday, that just yesterday, he was tweeting that he was going to commit more war crimes by bombing in Iran's infrastructure, their power plants, because that would just be attacking a civilian population. It has nothing to do with its military architecture, which America had claimed they'd long since obliterated, but it's continuing the war, right? Um, so, and even in reaction to the expletives, right, that Donald Trump tweeted that he would they should effing open the Strait of Hormuz, call Iranians crazy bastards, and then he goes in, praise be to Allah, you know, all of that, clearly is beyond the pale. All of that just seems like crazy, crazy, actions. But again, what is astonishing is, or what is not astonishing is the response of Americans to that. So it's only um, Republicans like Candace Owens and Marjorie Taylor Greene who are calling him insane right now. I guess it's only to them because they'd always idolized him in the past. They're calling him, crazy now. Trump's erratic conduct, crazy, outlandish behavior, right, has always been normalized. It's always been normalized, trivialized. Nobody's people have pretended like that. It was normal behavior. This abnormal behavior was normal behavior. This abnormal war. If any other nation had done what America just did, right, assassinate a sitting cabinet, kill kids, bombed a school and killed kids, right? They say that it's made up of crazy terrorists. That would be called terrorist behavior, right? But because it's America, it's Donald Trump, it's been normalized, right? It's just um, and maybe people are just helpless. I do not know. Um, but what I wanted to do now, because I've been talking about it, is that famous expression. Because I've been seeing lots of pundits, saying it. Well, the emperor has no clothes. The emperor has no clothes. So I thought it was appropriate for me to analogize, President Trump's behavior with that book, The Emperor's New Clothes. And it's a story, it's a folk tale, Emperor's New Clothes. It was published in 1837. The writer was a Danish author by the name of Hans Christian uh, Andersen, right? The Emperor's New Clothes. And basically, it describes a situation where the leader of a country has gone nuts, has gone crazy, but his misconduct, his madness was tolerated for a long time because there were sycophants didn't want to lose their jobs, and everybody felt nobody wanted to be able to speak out because they didn't want to be they didn't want to get in trouble, and things like that. And so that's been the situation possibly with President Donald Trump, because I've been trying to figure out why um, clearly, conduct that's clearly beyond the pale, that's if it's not outright madness, has become acceptable of, President Trump. And lots of Americans, you see, there's a reason, I wasn't just trying to be insulting to Americans generally. I'm an American citizen, but I did an earlier video and I talked about how when you travel to Europe, I lived in Italy and I remember Italians, they would just routinely say Americans are crazy, right? And I guess, maybe observing the gun culture in America, right? It doesn't make sense, just many things. Or maybe Americans act in a certain way when they travel overseas. I do not know. Um, and just the actions of President Trump, his cabinet members, the war, the prosecution of this war, the instigation, the precipitation of this war in the first place. There's no basis for it, and all of that is just is like a world of madness. It's just insanity. Um, just unfolding. In Nigeria, I talked about earlier that in Nigeria, madness was something that was grotesque. Insanity is something that's grotesque. It's not something in the open, right? You don't embrace it. We don't romanticize, uh, what is clearly cringeworthy, right? It's cringy. It's nothing to introduce to a normal uh, everyday life, right? There's a separate colony. They ostracize, alienate people that are deemed to be mad. They do not, um, they use a euphemistic clinical term of mental illness in America today. And again, that's not to conflate, those mild illnesses, right? People who suffer from anxiety or whatever. But mad, outrageous, severe mental illness, madness, that's what it's called in Nigeria. They are ostracized. Uh, if they're not in some kind of institutionalized in a sanatorium, they're placed in some kind of colony. They do not go to school. They do not marry. They do not interact with normal, regular people. If so, for instance, if someone who clearly suffered from madness, as Nigerians would put it, in back then, you wouldn't if they happen to speak with you, you would not respond to them, as you would be deemed insane as well. You would not respond to somebody who's clearly insane. I talked about people who were mad, who were they ostracized and placed in some kind of a sanatorium or a colony, separated from people, quarantined from the rest of society. Sometimes you would find somebody who maybe they're going through a process and then they suddenly break down, and they just their madness just started, or they managed to escape, or and you found them at the bus stop, or their madness is onset just started. So they strip themselves, they're clearly naked, they strip themselves naked, and they're eating from the trash, right? They're eating from the trash. And so such a person would be identified as mad. But prior to the authorities coming to pick such a person up and isolating them, taking them, putting them in a colony, right, or in a sanatorium, right, so they don't mix with the rest of society. If they happen to speak with you, you wouldn't speak with them, right? This is, of course, it's a violation of human rights, but I'm talking about in terms of culture and how it's very jarring, right, for people who come from certain cultures like mine. I'm Yoruba, where people don't fraternize with people deemed mad. That was a term, right? It's dated. It's outdated to use that term clinically in America now. Um, so you wouldn't respond to them. You wouldn't talk to them, right? Their actions would not be worthy of response. They wouldn't be. They're not engaged with in society. So they're removed from society and put away. So it's astonishing how things that I guess it's very shocking for a lot of us Nigerians who understand how this is treated back home. Nigerians don't, people who don't want to engage with what President Trump is doing or what America is doing right now. It's shocking. It's and we up to observe cringe-worthy stuff just unfold on a daily basis, and it's like you know some of these comments, like I done a video earlier and I mentioned that um, if one were to analyze the text of President Trump's Easter Sunday's his tweet, and if one didn't know it was President Trump, it was Donald Trump, or that the author was a president, and one were just asked to analyze that tweet. Um, and I talked about how I'd been in writing classes, technical writing classes, and where we had to analyze text. I identify the author, the message, and then the possible audience. You know, never, never, you know, no one would ever identify the author of President Trump's tweet using the F word openly. Effing, open the effing Strait of Hormuz, and calling Iranians crazy bastards, and then praise be to Allah, in the same text. No one would ever attribute that to the writing to a president, and a sitting U.S. American president, right? There used to be a time the rest of the world admired American presidents like uh, JFK, Abraham Lincoln, Barack Obama, even President Reagan. The world admired American presidents, right? They wore this nobility. You see, President Trump is evidence that you don't have, money can't buy you class, right? Especially if you've probably gone off the deep end, which a lot of even Republicans are saying now, right? If you see Candace Owens' tweets, right, and Marjorie Taylor Greene's, social media post as well, they both called him crazy, that he's insane, right? So, I wanted to just what I wanted to do was talk about that interesting folk tale by Hans Christian Andersen, you know, published in 1837, The Emperor's New Clothes. So it's about this vain emperor, very vain emperor, who had this obsession with um, flamboyant, fancy clothes. And so he had an obsession with it instead of paying attention to state affairs. And so one day, these pair of swindlers decided to con the emperor. So they proposed uh, making clothes for him, invisible clothes, which nobody would be able to see, right? No one, right? Or that, sorry, he would make this invisible clothes that everyone can see, except if you're incompetent. Only clothes that only the incompetent and the uh, the stupid would be able to see it, right? They're going to making these clothes, and only the incompetent and the stupid would not be able to see it. Only if you're stupid or you're incompetent, that's when you would not see these clothes. These magnificent clothes they were going to make for the emperor. So they proceeded, made the clothes, they collected money, and while they were supposedly even designing the clothes, the emperor and people, they'd go and look at the progress, everybody had to pretend that the clothes were in the process, and the swindlers as well, they'd affect you know to be observing the clothes, making the clothes. So the emperor had to pretend himself like like he could see it, so he wouldn't be called stupid or foolish, right? So eventually, when it was done, they donned the clothes on him and everything, and then he went paraded in the clothes, and even his courtiers, right? His courtiers, because again, they didn't want to be called stupid or incompetent. They really didn't want to risk their position. They admired the clothes, right? So the emperor was naked. They put these supposed invisible clothes on the emperor. No clothes, right? So he didn't have a stitch of clothing on, right? But the con men, right, had supposedly created this invisible attire outfit that only the incompetent and the stupid uh, could not see. And so they put it on the emperor, and the emperor too, he as well, because he didn't want to be called stupid, pretended he could see it, that he was wearing clothes, and he was completely naked, no stitch of clothing on. And he walked parading himself about in his new clothes that everybody was supposed to be admiring, and his courtiers also were admiring and praising him. And he paraded himself in the town, and for a long time, the townspeople too pretended that he was wearing clothes, that pretended that they didn't see what they were seeing, that the emperor was naked, as they say in America, he was butt ass naked, right? He didn't have a stitch of clothing on. They pretended that he was not naked so that they wouldn't be called stupid. Until one a young boy screamed out, "The emperor has no clothes." And when he did that, eventually, the rest of the community, the townspeople now burst out laughing and started to, they were hysterical. They started laughing and saying it as well. And by the time the emperor realized he'd been had, uh, what is significant though is, instead of giving it up that he'd been had, he continued to pretend that he was wearing clothes, continued to parade himself, even as the whole town mocked him, right? So that's the story. The emperor has no clothes, and that's where we are. For a long time, Americans have pretended, and they've said it, because Americans say very casually that somebody's crazy, right? They say very, because crazy has been normalized and accepted in American society, that it's nothing jarring unless you kill somebody, right? So President Trump is, it's not new that President Trump's been doing crazy things. He's been doing crazy things for a long time. And what is bizarre is we do have the 25th Amendment, but that's not being used. It's very difficult how to say it, because especially take a look at our Congress. Our Congress is probably filled with senile people. I recently read the story of, and I praised her so much. She was a very brilliant woman. But look, age does a number on your brain, right? On your acuity. It's nobody is invincible, and that's the problem with America. Americans don't value growing old, so you see old people still pretending that they're young people, right? Especially you see it amongst the liberals in New York. Um, our Senate is filled with very old people, right? People who should be retired and let younger people have yeah, giving younger people a chance. Back to pack, see our presidents, we've had octogenarians as president, at least septuagenarians. President Trump is going to be an octogenarian in a few months, right? Yeah, I think he's 79, right? The president before him, Joe Biden, was an octogenarian, right, in office, and so you see, it's an issue, when we're not, we refuse, the society refuses to acknowledge the toll the aging takes on acuity and and it's not, I'm not being ageist, but there could be dangerous repercussions when we dismiss or treat um, uh, the dementia associated with aging or senile dementia, and we dismiss it like it's unreal, or it doesn't happen with our government officials, like it doesn't happen, because it can come and bite us in the rear when we least expect it. Right now we are in a crazy war, you know and we're in a situation where the emperor is actually wearing no clothes, right? And who's gonna be that bold kid and scream out that the emperor is naked, right? The emperor has no clothes. The emperor is naked. Um, our story basically describes delusion, right? Delusion and madness, a form of madness, which is where America is right now, with respect to its government. My name is Olorotimi Osha, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.